So I'm going to talk today about how to make workflows work for you, which is more or less an introduction to the Zope and Plone workflow story and actually the workflow stories. It's intended for a pretty general audience, even so the talk says intermediate, but developers will definitely also get something out of it, of what we have been up to, some really interesting technical pieces. So my name is Stephan Richter, and I have been involved in the Zope community since 1999. I was there at the first sprints. I developed large parts of Zope 3, and I also have to admit I am the creator of Z3C form, which you all love to hate, I've heard this conference. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about workflows and hopefully give you some historical context. The last time I thought I talked at PloneConf in Seattle, till several people here told me that I actually was at 2008 in Washington, D.C. as well, which had been completely erased out of my mind. And somebody even told me that I gave a talk that year. Unfortunately, that was the first talk after the party, and I have zero recollection of this talk. And I have been told the talk was pretty awful. So apologies to that. I really thought it was 2006 that I gave last a talk. What happened since 2006? I had two kids, two sons. Anton is now 9 and Conrad is already 6, which is great, but it also means I have less time to play around with the technical stuff. A couple of years back, about 7 years back, I had some cardio problems and I decided I need to work out a little bit more. And of course, because I do everything in the extreme for the people who know me, I decided to do a couple of Ironmans and trained up for that and completed that. In 2007, I also decided to leave the consulting business and try startup life. And so I've been involved in 4 startups. Kias was in the healthcare industry. They tried to improve people's lives. At Active Broadband, where they had Comcast as a large customer, I developed a multicast IPTV system. At Cypher Health, we did some Obamacare related stuff. And now I'm since 3 years at Shoebox, where we handle all of the governance of early stage companies, from incorporation to equity management, board management. If you have a small corporation, or in Germany an AG, right, you know that there's just lots of overhead with maintaining that. And so Shoebox does a lot of this for you. All right, now enough about me. So here's sort of the history of Zope, and in that sense also Plone's workflow story. It all started in February 2001, really with the first commit to the CMF, and I dig this up, the Tresivers did that commit, was already a reference to CMF core, workflow core. And I remember the story actually quite nicely. Everybody in the community was excited about CMF coming out because Zope Corp had for a long time, or Digital Creations had for a long time announced that it would be coming. And everybody said like, but there's no workflow. You have all this workflow core definition and there is none. And Zope Corp said like, well, you should develop your own workflow. And everybody's like, no, but we don't want to. And eventually, Digital Creations got pressured into releasing their internal workflow tool based on CMF core called DC Workflow that Shane first publicly committed in June 2001. So it didn't take too long for the community to pressure Digital Creations into that. And it filled out all the functionality. And as I have learned this week, DC workflow is still in production and running, which is quite interesting if you think how old it is. Eventually, now I think by that time it was called Zope Corp, paid Zope Corp was paid to develop another workflow product, and basically it was for the Navy, and they required all these very stringent government processes, and that didn't really fit well in the DC workflow story. So Jim looked around and found the WFMC standard for which editors existed, and developed a workflow engine on top of this, which is known as zope.wfmc. And he tried to attempt to standardize this so multiple communities could share this sort of workflow approach. Clearly, with the departure of Zope Corp doing this type of work, it died in 2011. And actually the story around this is that Jim likes to tell, Paul likes to tell, Paul Everett, is the Navy paid Zope Corp a lot of money to put workflows into the system, but then they didn't like and didn't want to actually follow the process, and they paid them a lot of money to rip it all back out. So Zope WFMC never really saw production life for a long time in Zope Corp's world. So the last sensible commit was in 2011. As a reaction to Zope WFMC, because it was the only Zope 3 story, oh wait, I didn't turn this on. It was the only Zope 3 story. Is that? I get an echo here. Can you guys hear me back there? Okay, so I'll leave the mic off. That's better. I don't know whether you guys remember. I remember this vividly. Martin Fasen ran around the community and said, like, everything is too complicated in Zope 3. All these adapters, these utilities, that's crazy. And he had this tick for a couple of months to develop the hurry namespace, where everything is done in a hurry and very simple. And one of the outcomes was that he wanted to reproduce what DC Workflow does for Zope 2. He created hurry.workflow for Zope 3. I checked. He didn't seem to use it anymore, doesn't seem to use it anymore. And it ended up dying in 2013, was at least the last real bug fix that I commit. Well, along came my new startup, Shoebox, and it was a perfect match for workflow engine. So we decided to resurrect Zope.wfmc and see what we could do with it. And this talk is mostly about what we were able to do with the base and where we went and the problems we solved. But let's go back. So what is DC workflow and hurry workflow? It is known as a state-based workflow, right? That's what the community usually calls this. And the way it works is you have a target, in your case, usually a content object in Plone or document, and you have a single attribute where you store the state of that object, and then really the workflow engine consists out of defining transitions between these states, and including permissions and all this kind of good stuff that belongs to it. So the state machine, I want to really call it, is a state machine, manages the state and the transitions and then the progression of the states and enforces the rules of the transitions, right? And it's very simple. It's very, like, I think hurry.workflow is only 150 lines of code, which really represents the core of such a state machine. So I went to the Plone documentation and I found this example that I had seen already 15 plus years ago as the example for how to publish things on Plone, and it's still in the documentation, so I just redrew it and put it up here. So here's how it works, right? A state-based workflow. You have 3 states, draft, pending, and published, and you define the transitions which are represented by the arrows, and I put the actors that can, or participants, the roles that can execute that action here as well to simulate the security. Now, really the start and finish here makes no sense. I just did it so you know how to read it, and that it goes from left to right, because you're really maneuvering states, right? You don't think really about activities. Also very interesting, you can then take a published object and retract it back to the draft. So this is, right, what you guys, if you use Plone, do all day long. You might adjust this, add more steps or more states, more transitions, less transitions, but that's basically how it works. Now, the reality is state-based workflows are not really workflows. And there are 2 big problems with this. First of all, you can only manage a single target, like a single content object, and you can really only maintain 1 state at a time unless you define a second attribute and play this entire game again. And I was asking actually all week around here, so how is it done? Especially the single target. That really bothers me as a limitation. And I was really hoping for the answer that somebody tells me, well, really we create like a folder-ish object and dump all our resources like images and so on that belong to an article or blog post and publish that. But nobody gave me this answer. So it was all about like, we open a transaction and we push all the artifacts through and then we commit the transaction, it all works out. So sort of that was my the answer. And I was like sort of disappointed. I thought it had gone a little bit further than that in the last 10 years since I have been paying attention. Now, then I thought like, you know what? I really think we invented state-based workflows. So I went out there and looked for state-based workflows. And ironically, the .NET world, especially Microsoft SharePoint and even the Java world, have picked up this term, but I have not found a reference prior to 2001. So, are we to blame of having invented state-based workflows? Probably so. It's quite ironic. There are lots of things in the Python and larger tech community that were actually invented by the Zope and Plone community that people now just accept as a fact of life. We start with the term sprint that was taken by transceivers, and it ends with relative and absolute imports in Python, which were definitely a ZCML invention. Even so, Guido will never admit it. I was in the room when he picked this up. So, cool. So let's talk about activity-based workflows. Clearly, Zope WFMC is an example, and it is really based on BPMN. And BPMN is a graphical representation of processes, and it is widely used in many, many different industries. So, for example, I was in China a few years back, and of course, at a manufacturing company for electronics, and they are, of course, all ISO 9001 certified, which is a quality assurance standard. And what do I see? A gigantic wall with a gigantic process looking exactly like this. Oops. Let me see that I can turn this off. With a gigantic list of like these boxes there describing how the quality assurance process works. And non-surprising, if you talk to companies like IBM, Siemens, Deloitte, any of those big IT companies, when they talk about workflow, they mean that. And they all have super sophisticated tools to run these type of processes in any sort of industry, whether it's manufacturing, data warehousing, whatnot, and execute these workflows. So let's get back a little bit to the history. So BPMN exists for a long time, and it was mostly meant so everybody speaks a common language. Like everybody knows how to read a construction plan, you want to read a workflow. That's what BPMN was. The problem was people wanted to automate these processes, but BPMN 1.0 did not define a serialization format. So a bunch of the big players got together and created the WFMC, the Workflow Management Coalition, and defined an XML-based serialization format called XPDL. And so XPDL was then used by all the early workflow engines as the input format. Now, in the last few years, BPMN 2.0 was released, and it finally specified an XML serialization format of its own. It's part of the BPMN 2.0 standard. So in some sense, XPDL is now obsolete. But there are so many processes out there still using it that it will be around for a very long time. Now, the reason Jim also chose XPDL is because there was back then, even in 2004, there was already an editor around called the Java Workflow Editor. It was known as Java. Sometimes also we find references Together Workflow that can edit these XPDL files, including the ones that Zope WFMC could digest. And here you see a screenshot of such an editor with one of our more complicated or usual workflows loaded up. And the nice thing about a Java Workflow Editor is it's highly customizable because it's intended to be white labeled for large corporations. So the guys have a lot of bank customers and other highly structured organizations. I'll get to this in a bit. So let's convert our state-based workflow into an activity-based workflow. You will see a few differences. So these are our actors here, and these lanes are known as swim lanes. And you basically, and you almost always have a system swim lane where the backend executes something. And basically, instead of describing states and transitions, you only describe activity, things that you do, like more like the transition. But it's very different, right? So you create a draft of your article. Then you ask the reviewer or the manager or the editor to review the article and then publish it. And you can see publish is already a system step that is not even a human interaction, right? That happens once the article has been reviewed. This little diamond with the X is called an OR gate in BPMN, and it's basically just a simple if statement. You can have more than two coming out of this. At Shoebox, we always make it a Boolean decision because it makes it much, much easier to read and follow the workflows over time. And you can say no, then we go back into draft stage, and we do yes, then we publish it. I also added here, if the creator wants to retract his article, he can use this is an exception flow, that's why it's red. They can retract it. So you can have multiple endpoints. I just wanted to demonstrate that as well. Okay, are there questions about this? Because we're building up on this example for a little bit. Yeah?
How is this different? In other words, your rectangular box, that's a state, which is a noun, and your arrows are what we call verbs, the action.
No, exactly, it's not. You see that, look how I did not use nouns. We in Shoebox, as part of our quality assurance, that these boxes are never nouns, they're always verbs. It's create, draft, review, publish. So these are actions. Also, I have not made a single statement about what artifacts this workflow creates. Does it create one document? Does it create a document with lots of images? Does it create emails? You know, all sorts of artifacts. I've made no statements about that yet. Right? So there's actually no state from a content point of view involved here. And trust me, when I started this in 2013 again, I had to retrain myself too. It is very, very hard to make the transition initially, but once you get it, then it's easy. But it's, yeah.
So instead of just saying create draft, you could just say create,
yes,
review, publish. And you could, if you wanted to throw a noun in there, you could just say create thingy,
right,
whatever it is.
Right, exactly. But we specifically want to stay with our publication workflow and publishing an article. Yeah. So let's keep that in mind. Yeah. So let's look at the issues of this high-level workflow. This workflow, as I wrote it, is too high level to be useful. It is very, very hard to write machine executable code based on that workflow that actually will execute anything sensible because it leaves too much open. And that means the engine provides really trivial value, right? So there was almost no point in writing a workflow engine just for doing that. And that's, I think, the reason why Zope WFMC didn't survive initially is because it was way too high level for people to do anything useful with it. And really the only benefit now we get, right, that we didn't have with the Plone workflows or with the DC workflow is a graphical representation. But the graphical representation at that high level is so trivial that how much does it explain to you what you wouldn't have understood before? So now, I actually took that very trivial translation of the state-based workflow and actually implemented it as it would be runnable in Shoebox. So I created that workflow and stuck it into our system, and this is what I had to come up with. First of all, we never talked about who the creator and the reviewer are. So the first thing is you need to assign them. Several workflow systems hook their workflow engines up to LDAP and they auto-detect these things. We have found that doing that implicitly was not a good idea, so we have switched completely of assigning these swim lanes manually. And assign a creator basically says, hey, assign this lane to the person who initiated the process. And the reviewer, because we are a legal processes thing, is I assign to the president of the company. Only the president of the company can approve these articles. Just simply so it fits in the system nicely. We don't have a good concept of managers yet, so it wasn't that easy to do. So I changed the language a little bit to say author article, which basically means enter the title, the lead-in, and the description. And I'll show you this in the system in a second. Well, just because I provided the data, this is just simply a simple form input, similar to what you would auto-generate with all the nice Plone tools. You then have to generate the article. And in our case, these are mostly PDF documents. So in my case, I create a simple PDF document for review. And then let's skip that incoming OR gate. And then, right, because the creator never saw the generated article, I need a review step. So I need to give the, do I have actually, oh, I have even laser pointers so I can go further away. So you want to give the user the ability to review the article and potentially go back. And we do have capabilities to step back. So we skip this for now. And then this is an AND gate, which means execute things in parallel, because we send things off to approval to the reviewer to approve the article. But you know what? We don't want the creator to just sit there and not know what's going on, right? Because this approval in Shoeboxes, in our real cases, is many, many steps long. Because first the lawyers have to review it, then the board might have to review a document, then who knows who else have to give a sign-off. That's all depending on policy. So you want to give the creator some feedback. And this work item waits until this, or this activity waits until that activity completes. And then this gate waits until both errors, both transitions arrive. Okay, then it goes on, and depending on what the approval was like, if it was not approved, we go back to review. That's why we have to reset the rejection reason, right? So we have to clear it out so it doesn't go to no all the time. And then you go to yes. And you see yes is orange, which means it is the default flow. So if it doesn't find anything, or if any of the conditions are false, then it's like the else statement. That's basically else. And then it's a system step to publish the article. In our case, this means setting a finalized tag to it, assign certain tags to put it in the right folder, et cetera, et cetera. And then you really don't want to let the creator go from wait to approval to nothingness. You want to tell him, hey, your article is now published. You can now do X, Y, Z. So it's a convention at Shoebox to always have a next steps where we explain to you what happened afterwards. The other thing that we are doing is we are defining wizards, as you will see in a moment, and I want to point this out here so you can so we see this then working in the system. So we say this, and this work item are in one wizard. You just say you will have a wizard, and so you will see that for those 4 steps we have a nicely created wizard on top, and it auto-generates that all just by us putting a little marker on there. You have a wizard, you have a wizard, you have a wizard, you have a wizard. It scans the process definition and figures all this out. This also has a wizard. So I ran through this, and I thought, like, I created a great Shoebox process. Well, our QA failed because there's even one more step missing here. How does a reviewer even know that he has to review or she has to review an article? Well, there should be probably an email step somewhere here that is only sent the first time that says, hey, an article is ready for your review. So I hope you get a sense to what level of granularity you have to get to make these workflows really useful. Oops, I want to turn on my screensaver off. Dang it. So, all right. So I need to be behind the pult now anyways, because I want to show you a demo. And so all our Shoebox examples are modeled after Silicon Valley with Pied Piper and all its characters. So if you watch the show, you will get the references. If not, it will just be normal. So Ehrlich is, he's a wannabe president of the company, but he's not, as you know if you saw the show. But he is allowed to publish an article. So this is our interface. I can explain more of this later. Come to me after the talk if you're interested in some of the other things we did. But we want to publish the article, and from now on, everything is defined by the workflow definition we saw. You can see the wizard here. You see all the same titles show up, and I can just now type in Plone article in, it's 2016, so I won't forget. All right, and some text. And this is super trivial, right? You will also notice I can discard a process at any time. So we made that possible as well. So we continue. I can now review my article. I can download the PDF. I'm not going to open this right now, but we can also view the article in HTML because we can generate out of our XML document templates. And we can, for example, change the title. We can move to the next section, etc., etc. So I save this. And now I said, like, OK, my article is perfect. I send it off. And I didn't put a nice message here. Usually we would put a really nice message here. But you get a wait step. You're notified that you're waiting for somebody to approve this. Usually we even put the person here who is the approver and whatnot. But on the other side of things, there is Richard Hendricks, who is actually the president of Pied Piper. And he already, and we are using WebSockets to push things through. He now sees he has an article to approve. He can get a little quick overview. He sees, oh, it comes from Ehrlich, etc., etc. The document, unfortunately, is not showing up here because I didn't assign a certain tag, I have been told. But we can go in here, and he can now approve the article. A couple of cool things. Our document templates can be rendered into a visual format, so any condition, any loops have a visual representation, so our lawyers can review even just the template. If we would have multiple versions, we can even visualize version differences. And we ended up developing our own XML diffing library based on the famous white paper for this. Okay, so we continue. And Richard is done. Unfortunately, he doesn't get a next step, so that would be probably another QA thing that would pop up. But if we see, due to the push, thanks to the push, the next steps show up. Every time we press continue, we send actually a task to Celery. And if the tasks take a long time, there's a spinner that will push back and tell you what it is currently working on. So there's a lot of cool WebSocket-based technology and async technology in all of this. So we can do the next. Unfortunately, Ehrlich is not privileged enough to see these documents. So we go back to Richard, and we can see if we go to his documents. So we can go to articles. The PloneConf article showed now up. And it didn't show, I should have shown that, it didn't show up before it wasn't published because certain tags get set. So we have actually this concept of states as well, but we just call them tags that are namespaced. And we just have multiple tags on one attribute, and we manage them through our workflows. OK, are there questions about that example? Cool. So
you
yeah.
mentioned the OR gate, X,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
but you didn't elaborate on it. You said we'll move on from that.
Yeah. OK, sure. So yeah, we have learned over time that OR gates always come in pairs, or most often come in pairs, because you say XOR, but then you usually with one you go back, right? And you have to join together. While the XPDL standard allows for many transitions to come into a main activity, because this is also just an activity, several other not so sophisticated editors do not allow it. And it is much easier to reason about your workflows and read them if you make another OR gate there. And OR gate only means it only waits for one incoming transition and not for both. The AND gate is exactly the opposite. It always does send off both, not just one, and it waits for both. Or for n. It can be any amount. And we have some where we do 5 or 6 things at the same time. All right, any other questions? Cool. So, just a little summary of what are the big things that we had to build in order to make all this work. Security, but Plone has that too. Check, right? We are using the ZOP libraries after all. We use ZOP security, of course, and ZOP security policy. So we have exactly the same type of capabilities as they are on Plone today. Machine executable. DC workflow does that too, right? It's machine executable. Check. Full user interface generation and any other I/O generation. That only works for DC workflow because it's super, super trivial. And you can do one size fits all basically approach, right? Because you only have to show states, the current state, and what other state you can get to. there's very little metadata even around any of this. So, and for the publication workflow, that's not that matter. But all of these screens that you saw, they're all standard activity types, applications they are called. So that's that. So you need to implement back and forth. I didn't demonstrate this, but you can go back and forth. You saw the back and forth arrow, right? Because people expect, if they see a wizard, I want to jump to this point. You can also click on the wizard itself and jump to a particular point. And then you want to go forward again. And then the problem that arises out of this is, well, you should really remember the data that I typed in the past and in the future, which is also not necessarily trivial, especially if you now make changes in the past that affect the future. Right? So you have to be very careful of what data you retain. Discarding, and of course discarding with cleanup. So you say, I don't want this workflow, it was a crapshoot. Ignore it. And so you want to make sure all the articles and everything gets deleted. Exception handling, that was what broke SOAP WFMC's neck originally. And then migrations. Migrations are super, super important. As we upgrade our applications and our processes, if you update your process, you cannot just run on the new version suddenly, because where are you? Do you have all the data? So we do a lot of version management and then migrate data very carefully. And it's a big problem. We haven't really fully solved it yet. Okay, so we did a bunch of SOAP WFMC enhancements, and all of these enhancements we put back into the SOAP WFMC core. Unfortunately, not yet in the SOAP Foundation repository. It's on our Shoebox. We have a clone on Shoebox, but if there's interest from the Plone community to use SOAP WFMC, we would have certainly good motivation to clean things up, write the necessary tests and documentation, and publish it further. But till now, nobody came along, so we hadn't had much willpower to do it. So XPDL 2.1, the original one only supported XPDL 1.0. We added extended attributes. So to any activity, to any process, to any participant, you can put any amount of metadata. And then, in fact, entire XML substructures called extended attributes. And that wasn't implemented. We use that heavily to hint the UI, to hint, as you will see, the simulations and the testing, and many other things. So this is basically our crutch to do a lot of the automation. Candidate support. So let's say you have two presidents of the company, and you might think that's not possible, but yes, it is. You can have co-presidents that can approve. So you have multiple people. We have the capability of saying, yes, multiple people can do this, and somebody takes the ball and says, I'm going to do it. So candidate support, which is a very core feature of workflows. We implemented subflows. Think about it as macros, right? Like metal macros. Task scripts, which are basically arbitrary Python scripts. You did see one with the reset. Data field support, which gives you data typing. Parameters didn't support initial values. Otherwise conditions, the else case that I showed you. Script tag support, because you can specify on a process what scripting language you're using. And arguments to the activities, because, dang it. Uh-oh, we lost it. Do you guys have it over there? Oh, okay. I hope the clicker works far enough, so I'll come over here. I have been warned that would happen. Oops. Arguments to activities, because you pass in variables, you get variables out, used to be lists. And we converted them to dictionaries, which was a big pain for our migration, because it's much easier if you have key value pairs to do migrations if you get new arguments. Unfortunately, this was thanks to Jim. I didn't tell him about this little thing when we met earlier this week. And then deadline support. So you can say, if an activity hasn't been touched for a day, what do you want to do about it? So you can raise an exception and take an alternate path through the system. All right. We also enhanced the workflow editor a little bit. We worked with the Together Workflow guys. They do a lot of stuff in the Java community for banks, especially in Switzerland and Austria. The owner is originally from Austria, but they're all in Thailand. So we paid them to do a couple things like small bug fixes and larger bug fixes that made it possible to use, how the labels can be positioned, script support, and external editor support. So you can click on a thing And if you specify Python as a script, it opens it up in a temporary file that has the right file extension, so you get the syntax highlighting and all that kind of good stuff in your external editor. That we could do a lot more, but we simply haven't gotten around to it yet. Okay, so let me talk about a couple of really hard problems that we had to solve. Discarding a workflow. Well, originally, Zope WFMC didn't keep track of any of the activities it had already finished. So we had to start keeping track of all the finished activities, so when you discard it, we could undo them. It requires for all of your activities, or these applications that drive these activities, to be reversible, right? You have to be able to say, this generated a document, now we need to remove the document. There are some cases where you have irreversible actions. For example, you created a user. The user has received an email to log in. Well, just because you want to undo your workflow, you don't want to create suddenly a broken link for the user because you deleted the user. So it's better to just leave the user existence. They don't have any access anyways, so it doesn't matter. Or you make the workflow simply non-discardable. And the prime example of this is, once all parties signed a document, it is legally binding. The document cannot suddenly go away because you discarded your workflow. So in those cases, we make the workflows at that point non-discardable, which sometimes really makes our users mad, but because we make it so easy to execute legally documents that they don't even think about it that way. Back and forth, I mentioned that already before. You have to be able to revert the activities. You have to restore the workflow state properly, and remember the inputs, as I mentioned. And that's a very, very hard problem. We spent alone just to solve this. There are 6 man-months worth of effort in that. The wizard, I mentioned that before. You saw it nicely going up on top. The hard part about it is it needs to be generated before any workflow state exists. And as more workflow state comes into play, the wizard actually adjusts and finds the path that you're actually going to take. So once you reject, it will readjust, for example, the wizard. This is also a very hard problem to get right, especially because of all the splitting and joining that you can do. And we spent roughly at least 3, if not 4 to 5 man-months just solving the wizard problem. What happened? Next. Whoa. Okay, there it is. Now, if you have a lot of processes, and I don't know how the Plone does that, I would love to talk to some people how this is done. And I'm running this video, which is a simulation of our workflow, run in Firefox, fully automated, is testing, right? And so you want to automatically test your workflows. You want to have coverage. So the big part is you have to provide a strategy for completing your applications. And that took us also 2 to 3 attempts to do. We ended up writing extended attributes on each activity, on each interactive activity that the user has input to, define how the user would input stuff, and then complete the activity, and then it would keep going. You want to have save points. We have processes that take 10 minutes to run, or large ones like this. If the developer works on the last 2 work items, you don't want to have them wait 9 minutes before they get any feedback. So we create save points that you can create, and you can start the workflow anytime from that spot. Debugging, you can stop at any activity. We can take screenshots at any interactive activity, and we can parameterize our simulations so that we can create very rich setup environments. For example, the Pied Piper example that I showed you, we just completely simulate that. This is never typed in from hand. So let's see what's next. Okay, so I don't know how are we doing in time? Oh, almost good. So quality assurance. So I'm going to just show you the quality assurance instead of going over the steps. So we created a very rich dashboard because we deal with lawyers and they have 0 tolerance for problems. Not just functionally, but also from a language point of view. So we have 98 processes that can be started from the UI. There are about 200 or 300 of them with all the sub-processes. For those 98 processes, we wrote 300 sims. And then we have all sorts of document templates, and we test all the permutations of these documents. And in those 98 processes, we have 3,500 activities. So that's a lot of stuff to run. And yesterday, our QA dashboard was all green, and it was quite boring. But today, I have some interesting stuff to show. So we test all our processes on the 4 major browsers. And then we run also a bunch of QA checks. So I can show you a little bit of output. So let's not take the stock transfer. So for example, it ran in Internet Explorer, this simple workflow. So we get all the Internet Explorer output, including a screenshot for each step of the workflow. In this case, it was just one, so maybe I should choose a little bit more interesting example, like the stock transfer. So here you can see Internet Explorer. It tells you it was Internet Explorer 11. And when it ran, and here are all the screenshots of Internet Explorer. And so our UX department can go through these PDFs and check that all the browsers render the stuff correctly. If the simulation was successful, you can also see all the documents that get generated here for your review. We have lots and lots of process controls. So for example, whether it's completed, whether we get the same output as last time. So this is all good. And here's our coverage. So if you want to see how is the process covered, what is it, transfer? Transfer certificate. Yep. This one is actually 100% covered. But let's say we go to the upload case. So that's just one simulation. And of course, one simulation can never cover the entire article. So we can see that simulation went through this specific path. So we have insights of what paths were actually taken by our simulation. And then basically the top one combines all the simulations, and it's 100% for this particular case. So let me just find actually the one where we have also PQA failure. So here, for example, the long-term stability output changed, so we keep track of any state change in the system, and we create a diff, and then we compare the diffs, and we use a JSON diff tool to do this. And so we see here, for some reason, this process now has a new email that is being sent, and somebody didn't accept that properly. So that's our QA tool and how we make sure that all our processes function all the time. And this is run, we can run this on a daily basis, or even more often. It takes about, these days, 45 minutes to complete for a full test run. Okay, so what's up in the future? I would love to write the Shoebox Chronicles. That's also something that I tried to do early in the days with in the SOAP community. My dream was always to write these REST documents and describe, hey, run something like this in the browser, take a snapshot of the browser and insert a screenshot. And so that we can create support help in an automated way. And then a funny story to this, about 2 years ago, our customer success person was really enthusiastic about writing lots of support articles. So she kept writing, and I sat there like, in a few months, you will have to revise all of these. You will have to revise all of these. And no, we keep writing, we keep writing. We had 72 of them. 1 month back, we finally did a review. We threw them all away. All 72 were completely thrown away because, of course, they completely bit-rotted. Nothing in those support articles worked, described anything like the system worked. So I would love to just create these support articles via this. And it's not super hard. I would also like to automate video generation, right? Then you could have little self-support videos. And thanks to Selenium, that shouldn't be a big deal. I just have not gotten around to hooking this up. The holy grail for us is to really support the power user. If you can use Excel, or if you're a Plone user, not a developer, but a user who can configure a system and create articles, you should be able to create processes in our system. So our idea is that eventually people with legal expertise, lawyers, paralegals, can create new processes most easily. That is probably still about 5 years away because we would have to rewrite or do massive customizations to the editing tool and put a lot of more security in a lot of the Python expression evaluation, et cetera, right? So in the Plone world, you're well aware of what it takes to allow people to enter arbitrary executable code. at whatever level. And on a personal note, I would love to bike across the US before I get too old. So, okay.
You never get too old. You just have to go very slow.
Yeah, but I also have family, so my goal is to make it in 30 days. Questions, comments, and before I forget, please go to PloneConf6feetup.com and rate the talk. Yeah.
So as far as actually creating the workflow, that was one thing I didn't quite get. So
Yep.
I saw this GUI tool.
Yep.
And it looked like you're able to edit the visual representation of
Right.
it. And I saw the end result.
Yep.
So the web interface.
Yep. So we upload that XPDL file into our system. It's part of our source code. And I did a bunch of other things in the back end, such as creating tags, creating a new folder for this data room, creating an entry for the actions. All these are configuration, very much like you used to from the Plone world. And then it just works. So there's no, I literally wrote 0 Python code. Like 0, I did not have to modify our code base, our Python code base, in order to make this work. So that's a very significant goal for us. But high-level developers can do this. And I'm more than glad, maybe after the talk, for people who are interested, to show them the editor tool and show you a little bit more of the magic that goes on behind and why the simulation works, why the wizard shows up, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah?
You spoke about having multiple objects that travel together.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you had, well, what we have is kind of an idea where multiple objects travel together, but they travel through separate workflows that sometimes share states, and then sometimes some of them will break off and come back. And so what we've got is these cascading workflow guards and rules, but just way out of control. And I wondered, what are you doing?
Right. So that is an outcome of the state-based workflow approach, right? So what we are doing is basically we collect data. So I did not bring up any of our sophisticated processes like incorporating a company, which generates 5 documents, for example. Post-incorporation, when you set up your board and stuff, creates about 10 documents. So what we are doing is we are collecting the data via forms. You could do this in Plone very easily with all the machinery that you have. And then we generate these documents in system steps. And we can create many system steps to create many documents in all sorts of ways. And then we bring them back in. And then we move them along. Because your action is not really, so what's your action, right? Or what's your goal? A process always achieves a high-level goal. For example, incorporating a company, right? These documents, if they interact, they are not living in isolation. They move together. Like, for example, I could imagine in the content management world, you have a lot of these things. As I started, you might create an article that has images to it. You might want to need to push. You want to publicize this, so you push to some external website, right? So you have all these versions and artifacts around, but your goal is still to publish an article.
But in the case where...
Give me a concrete example of what you're doing.
I'll take from that. In the case where you want to say, okay, we have 10 documents, but the people on the other side are in a real hurry, and they can't see anything until we've published the parent. But we have 2 that we can't publish yet, but we want to pre-publish. We want to say, this thing is now being published, but the state of the main object is not published, but those 8 have been published. And when the guy comes in, he can see, but these 2 are still out. So either he can't see them, or he can see that they're there, but they're in a different state. So the state of the inside of the state of things inside of those 10 is all over the place. But somehow the workflow needs to be able to say, when those 2 become ready to be published, he needs to be able to say, okay, well now publish.
Right.
And
So we would create one process instance, right, for each document that gets published. So you create 10 publish a new article processes, because you need to move 10, need to be authored and whatnot. And then we would create, for example, you might have something else that is called pre-publish, right? You can say then, oh, let me pre-publish on that. Would just be another process you execute. So we are not thinking of this as necessarily as one workflow, but it's many workflows.
So you could publish the main container, and you could ask it then to push each of those 10 through its publish, and 2 of them would fail.
But you see, you're still thinking very much in terms of state-based workflow, because you're thinking about publishing a container. or talking about making the container available, right? I would not even, like, the way I showed is like you wouldn't even think about a container. That's just a side artifact that they live in the same container. Like, for example, the same folder or whatever. What your real goal is to generate these articles, these documents, and that they live eventually at the same, like, I would not make my permissioning based on the container, right? You want to really make your permissioning work against each document itself, and then you publish the document one by another, and thus you can apply different rules.
The code that you said is currently living somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Please, will you let us? I really want to have a look at that.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, one feedback when I did my practice run this morning with the company was he said like I should have added the links. I'll add the links to the slides and then I put it on slide shares and then it should be available. I'll send whatever Sally does with the publication and you can look at it and get to it.
Thank you.
Yep.
I have so many more questions, but I'll
we can talk afterwards. I'm here. So any other questions? Yeah, Carlos.
Not a question, a comment.
Yeah.
I saw your historical overview. There was an activity-based workflow for soap that was created in Italy. It's called OpenFlow.
Right. Oh, yeah. Why didn't you tell me this yesterday? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was OpenFlow, but I think it now really. Yeah, it was for a while. I guess it was used.
You know, it's just the same terminology, the work items and the applications
Yes.
and activities. And
Yeah, but they didn't use XPDR. I think
No,
they weren't graphical,
and
right?
obviously.
Oh yeah, that's right.
For a long time.
David DiVincenzo did that one, right? OpenFlow. David DiVincenzo developed OpenFlow, I think.
I think the names of the developers are Richard Lemmy or something like that.
Oh, Ricardo Lemmy.
Oh, Ricardo.
Lemmy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Vincenzo Di Barone.
Wait, Vincenzo Di Barone did that?
He's in the.
That's why I mixed this up. Yeah,
no,
yeah.
no,
That's,
no, Di Barone. No, sorry, no, Di Somma.
the Disoma. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that is true. I forgot about that. There was OpenFlow at some
But
point.
of course, there's no commits to that.
Yeah.
That would have been a good one to add. That's true.
Huh?
I tried to use it once in a project and couldn't quite figure it out.
I did use it for a bank.
And any other questions? All right. Thank you very much for coming.